Welcome to Talkin, Maine. I'm back with Judge Alexander. Don, welcome again back to the show.
Thank you, Tom. Glad to be here.
First half hour flew by.
Glad to join you again to talk about various things on Maine legal history.
Issues,
And
now Paul's gone, so you and I got a lot of space to
good
fill
old
up.
times in Farmington. And
So, Your Honor, I mean, your book, I just want to touch on a couple things in your book. We just talked about this, the Dred Scott decision, where the U.S. Supreme Court found one thing and Maine Supreme Court found the other.
Yes.
So talk a little bit about that, because that was fascinating.
The U.S. Supreme Court had said that basically, African Americans, if they were enslaved, weren't people entitled to voting or citizenship or anything, that they were property, not people. The legislature asked the Maine Supreme Court, is that true? And the Maine Supreme Court says, absolutely, the U.S. Supreme Court was wrong. Really? And wrote a very critical opinion of the U.S. Supreme Court that says, African Americans are people. It doesn't matter whether they're enslaved or not. They are people. They're entitled to vote, which was big, because a lot of states had said they weren't entitled to vote. And it talked about how the Supreme Court was wrong. There was one judge who went along with the Supreme Court, but the majority, and we're talking at the time there was a eight judge Supreme Court. Didn't become back to 6 and now 7 until the Superior Court was adopted. But yes, I mean they were just, that's the way it was, because this was before the Civil War.
So it was, but I'm just trying to remember the date. But yes.
This is 1850s, before the Civil War, when of course the issue was hot and a challenging issue.
Wow.
And and we recognized that they were entitled to vote, citizenship, and everything else.
Well, certainly Maine was at that time a strong abolitionist state. I mean, we had the Underground Railroad. It came through this area, went through strong. Republican Party started in strong Maine because of the abolitionists that were up there.
That's right.
So it just, that tied together so nicely in what I've known about that. One of the other ones I found really interesting is John Adams apparently had his finger in Maine court system.
Absolutely, because,
that's President John Adams.
No, yes. Not ever the Maine court system, however. This was, he actually was a very active litigator and regularly appeared, among other places, at the Pownellborough Courthouse.
No kidding.
Which was the second constructed courthouse in Maine. There was one earlier in York County. But at the Pownellborough Courthouse, he appeared and argued cases. It was a very active court from the time it was built in 1761 as part of the Massachusetts court system until they switched to a court in Wiscasset in the mid-1790s after the Revolution, and we changed. And since then, Wiscasset has been the county seat, but for about 30 years, Pownellborough was the county seat for Lincoln County, and Lincoln County was a lot bigger than it is now because other counties like Kennebec split off from it.
And Franklin County also split off, not off of that one, but off of something else.
Yep, that's right.
One of the ones we talked about briefly, and you talked about how you learned about it, was Malaga Island.
Malaga Island.
Malaga Island.
Yep.
And it's one that I remember reading a big newspaper story about that. But let's talk about that for a couple minutes, because that's another fascinating part of Maine's history.
And it's a part of Maine's history that has only been written about and become subject to discussion like the last 5 years. Yeah. I mean, which is amazing. What happened at Malaga Island was in 1912, when all of a sudden, out-of-state tourism became big and occupying for properties on the coast and things like that, around 1900, that people were really, 1880, people really started coming up here and, vacation, and you'd come up for 3 months in the summer, build cottages, which were huge houses along the shore, things like that. And off of Saginaw County, there was an island called Malaga Island, where since the 1840s, a group of black and mixed race individuals had developed a fishing community, which was much like other fishing communities in Maine, relatively poor, These people had to work very hard. Remember, in those days, you were either sailing or rowing a boat, going from, you know, trap to trap, or trying to get fish with lines out the back of the boat, things like that. Not much netting yet, because you didn't have the power equipment to pull it forward. By 1912 there was, but not when the community was originally organized in the 1840s, 1850s, things like that. And there were, you know, and there was an island community of them doing like other, you know, poor fishing communities on the coast did. And then some people in the state decided it just wasn't, it didn't look right, it wasn't clean enough, there was something wrong with the people, which was because
Garbage.
yeah, the only thing different was they were mixed race or black. And so beginning in the late, like 1908, something like that, there was discussion about removing them so we could have a cleaner place on the island, Malaga Island. And they were ultimately, a court order was issued. They were made guardianship over them, which was totally wrong.
The state has took guardianship over them.
Yes, the state took guardianship over them, and then removed them and told them to get off the island. If you want, you can bring your houses with you, which was easy, I guess easier to do then, because this was there was no mainland route to this island. It wasn't like, you know, Deer Isle is now, for example. You know, and they were then removed, and because they were regarded as guardianships and not sufficiently competent, a lot of them were placed at what was then the Pineland School, which was then called the State School for the Feeble-Minded. Oh, horrible that this could happen now, but this was what was done as a matter of course then in dealing with the, and then after that, Malaga Island, not much happened with it in terms of development. The governor had made it so a private person was deemed to own it. Governor placed it at the time, but he really didn't. And I think it might still be possible if, you know, relatives could be located to have an action to say, hey, this was our island. Because, remember, well, you know, working up here, you've seen, you know, a lot of our adverse possession laws and things like that. There's no question that the people on Malaga Island, who were the fishermen, like that, they occupied it as owners from the
more than 20 years. Yeah,
well, 1850s to 1912. You know, well more than 50 years, or well more than 20 years, or even if there's some adverse possession things have a 40 years. Either way, they could have done it. The problem is, you know, again, what has happened to the interest since then? Is it waived? Is there, can people be found who are residents?
Prove that descent.
Because they took the family records off, they took the graves off, and switched them to again the Pownell, again then called the School for the Feeble-Minded. Was horrible. And it was the same year that, again with state approval, that thousands of acres of you know, the Wabanaki lands were taken for a dam on the St. Croix River. The exact same year, 1912. 1912 is a really unfortunate year in Maine history for mistreatment of indigenous and African American people.
Wow.
You know, in two separate events that, from my research, I could find no court activity, no indication of any legal actions taken to protect the people. The only court activity I found was a reference to one judge who appeared to have been the probate judge who would have had to issue the guardianship determination for the Malaga Island. So basically doing what the state wanted. But no activity of the bar, the Maine attorneys trying to protect the people, and certainly no activities of the state. The state was the moving party.
And that kind of leads towards the Indian lands claims case in some ways, because those people did say that they had rights to this property because it was taken away from them illegally, which led us to the 1980 lands claim case, which has now led us to still this conversation and discussion that's going on.
Right, that's right. And what happened there was a treaty with Massachusetts in 1793, and then Maine, when it became a state, agreed to respect all the elements of the treaties with the Wabanakis, the indigenous people, and by lack of action, corporate interests, big landowners were just allowed to sort of take over the land. And the state, by the way, assumed, sort of trustee status over the Indian lands and allowed people to, without adequate compensation to the Native Americans, to use it, to take it, and all. And that then started to resist that, and that led to the Indian land claims case and solution. An interesting fact about the Indian land claims in relation to today's discussion is that at the time the Indian land claims was done, and the Indians were then treated essentially the same way as municipalities, had degree of independence, things like that. At the time, that was regarded as good by a lot of people, because at that time, the federal laws relating to the federally recognized Indian tribes were much more restrictive and disregarding of the tribe's individuality and interests and things like that. That changed in the, I think, 1990s, maybe in the late 1980s, but well after the Indian land claims is done. And a lot of that has led to some of the concerns today that the tribes are not as well treated as the federally recognized tribes. But that was not the case when the Indian land claims was adopted. They were regarded then.
It was a success. They were getting better protections or better opportunities.
Better opportunities, better independence, a large amount of cash, and of course they did give up a lot of the lands. Yeah. And then the other question is obviously what rights do they have in the in the waterways and things like that were presently that were where they did fish and hunt as they wanted to. And now that's become an issue again.
It's just one that I got very close to as you talk about the island and so forth and the misuse of the Indian land is what the public lands case that I just finishing up with is because the big landowners took all that over with and we took it back from them in 1993 in the Constitution and said, this is ours. If you're going to change this, it belongs to the people. It does not belong to the industry that could take it away from that, which was a pretty significant thing that took place.
Though it allowed the state to lease, be it concessions or everything like that, on the public lands. I mean, that's how you have concessions in the state parks and things like that.
So the KKK was here. I mean, I knew this. I've seen pictures of parades they used to have. In fact, there's a picture in Farmington that they paraded down the street one Memorial Day. But they were different. They were not. They were anti-Catholic, weren't they? Or
well, the KKK was created in the South, anti-black. They were there, and they were part of the participants in the violence of the Reconstruction that basically, or the so-called reconciliation, where the gains the African Americans had made, the right to run for office and things like that, voting and things like that, was effectively taken away from them by violence and by laws in the South. KKK was involved in that. Then the KKK, because of the relative success of the reconciliation, construction of all the Confederate statues, things like that, kind of went lesser. And then in the right around World War I, with a lot of the immigrants increasing power and respect and things like that, they began recreating, and against black Americans where black Americans were, trying to reverse them, but they became very active in Maine, including one person, Owen Brewster, who was elected governor, claimed he was not a member, but was elected with strong support of the KKK in Maine. And one of their principal targets was Franco-Americans and the Catholic religion, which was shared by Franco-Americans and the main significant Irish population.
Right.
They were very active from the late teens, right after World War I, through the 1920s. Less active after that, though obviously Owen Brewster remained a successful figure in Congress. First getting elected after he was governor, being elected to the House and then the Senate, And of course, in the Senate, he ultimately was defeated in the 1952 primaries for the Republican primary because he had been an active supporter of Joe McCarthy, which we then had the tremendous, wonderful, courageous statement of Margaret Chase Smith, who had called him out, and though he was in the same same party as Brewster and Margaret Chase Smith, and McCarthy called him out on that, and then the anger at the positions he was taking for McCarthyism in Maine caused him to be defeated in the primary by Frederick Payne, I think it was, anyways, who was then replaced 6 years later by Ed Muskie.
So Payne was a Republican then, and then Muskie came along.
Yeah.
Wow. So in 1921, I wrote it down here, but I can't remember what it is. The court made a decision or offered an opinion about women.
Yes.
What was that opinion?
Well, in 1874, after we had admitted one of the first women to the bar in Maine, in a ceremony down in Machias, the Supreme Court issued opinion said that women could not hold public office. The question that came up, this was in 1874, was to whether a woman could be a justice of the peace. And the Supreme Court, an opinion of justices, I think it was an opinion of justices, not a case, said no. In 1921, after adoption of women's right to vote, the women's suffrage, I think it was the governor, Baxter, asked, basically an opinion of justice, is this still the case? And of course, the Supreme Court under Justice Cornish said, no, it isn't. Women can hold public office. And subsequently, women were appointed to public offices, that had, judicial authority or reported to the Industrial Accident Commission, things like that. I mean, the first woman that was a quasi-judicial officer was appointed to the Industrial Accident Commission.
Which was what? Did they look at accidents in the workplace? Kind of a pre-OSHA thing?
No, the Industrial Accident Commission is the precursor of today's Workers' Compensation Board.
Okay, gotcha.
After, again, this was after World War I, there was a lot of, I don't know which way this went, but to have industrial accidents dealt with differently than just in the regular court system. That may be because the corporate interests wanted it that way. I don't know that history. But if you were hurt at work, it was dealt with through the Industrial Accident Commission without having to have a show of negligence, but also without it going to court. And therefore, it was strict limits on the amount you could recover and things like that.
So you served in the court system for 41 years and 1 month.
Yep.
So what were some of the interesting things that you saw in there? You must have seen some really crazy things come at you.
Well, you certainly see some, crazy or interesting things come at you. I don't want to make and evaluate cases. I had a lot of cases. A lot of them had a lot of visibility. Some of the crazier things in cases were ones that didn't have much visibility. For example, there's an old adage, when you're doing cross-examination, don't ask a question you don't know the answer to. Well, here's one. We had a very good, neurologist, physician. This is in a civil case. He's testifying in a civil case. And this is in the late 80s, early 1990s. I think the late 80s. He had come to the United States after having escaped from Poland during the uprisings and some violent things in 1956. And so he's being questioned by an attorney about this is the case of an accidental shooting at a drive-in theater in Manchester, the place that was until recently J&S Oil Company. And the attorney, without knowing the answer history, he's talking about how this would have happened, the doctor is, and the bullet, and things like that. And the attorney asked him, well, doctor, I won't use his name, you've never seen anybody shot. The doctor looks at him and says, I have shot people. I mean, a lesson for, don't ask a question. unless you
Wow.
have the answer to. Another interesting case, again, not visible, was we had a case down in Machias. It involved an alleged assault, of what the case is about. And I forget the exact details of the facts, but the facts leading to the case that was I was having a preliminary hearing on were this. It was New Year's Eve, sometimes in the late 80s, maybe early 90s. I think it was like in the late 80s. Two guys thought that a third person was ratting on them for, on what drug work they were doing, and they were going to go have a little talk with him. So they go over to us. They drive over on an ATV. Two guys on an ATV going over to this other guy's house. It was in Road Bluffs, and the first thing they do is they decide they're going to take the phone off the house so they can't call the police. And so what one of the guys does, and I don't know how he did this, but the testimony was it happened. He went and he bit the wire off the house, yeah. So anyways, they then went and pounded on the door and to try to get in. And the guy looks inside the house, and the man's wife is on the phone calling the sheriff. And they yell, "The phone won't work, we've cut the wire." And the wife says to him, "You dumb blank blank, that's the cable TV wire. I've got the sheriff's office on the phone right here."
Oh, jeez.
Now take it easy, don't run away yet. And at that point, the guys push the door into the house, and the guy comes down the stairs. And maybe your house is like this. The guy comes downstairs and runs into the kitchen and picks up his chainsaw and starts it and pushes the guys out of the house. Back
with his chainsaw.
With his running chainsaw, which was in his kitchen.
Okay.
But now do you do that?
No.
Me, I don't know.
I was trying to cut my meat for my steak.
Anyways, they push them out of the house and down the front steps, and the guys are backing up, and then the chainsaw stops. And then the guy at that point, tosses it aside, dives under a truck. At that point, the deputies arrive, and I don't remember what happened after that. But,
Oh, jeez.
but that's I mean, there are so many stuff, and I used to say, and I think it was true, that anytime I went and sat for more than a week in Washington County, I'd have a good, good story. And that's probably true of some of the other, rural counties too. A lot of great people there. Some of them, particularly in the winter, they may drink a little too much, and even though they're wonderful persons, they turn
into a different person.
Do some things they shouldn't.
Yeah.
And that's what it can be, and that's because some of the best stories don't really come from the big cases.
Right.
Big cases, some of them you're not supposed to talk about, because theoretically you're not supposed to talk about cases afterwards. I let other people evaluate that. I mean, so I've certainly had a lot of high visibility cases too, but the ones you see are the ones that come off. I had one in Washington County again where it was about an assault at the local town meeting, and what had happened was this particular town was also had a school district, and they'd allowed one driver's ed person who did driver's ed contractor to have an office in the school building, and this other person who had been previously also working with the school, they didn't let her have an office in the school building. So at the town meeting, they're talking about it. And she's upset and pushes one of the selectmen, goes out, and she might have thrown something at a car too. And they at that point had her prosecuted for assault, and it came up before me, and I gave her a fairly light sentence, and at that point the selectmen in the paper were complaining about soft on crime. Soft on crime. I forget the terms used, but there was some sort of select terms from one of these selectmen who had because the person was said a name and then quote Old Biff, and then the last name was quoted in the Bangor paper, which some of my clerks had seen, and law clerks showed it to me when I was back, because this had happened while I was filling in Washington County, and then a law clerk showed it to me, what was in the paper, when I was back in my office the next week. Anyway, so it's a challenging position, but and you've seen you've been involved with courts for I don't know, we're both dangerously dating ourselves then, but you were involved in courts with the IP when you were doing IP work, and that was at least 30 years ago, right?
It was 30 years ago.
Yeah.
I did 20 years with when I came to IP in 1991, right after the strike, and we had so many court cases, and the town of Jay had their own local environmental ordinance, and they were doing things, and we were doing things, and it was an eye-opening experience. Let's just say that. I joke because in there in the book you talk about how a lawyer could become a lawyer without really going to law school.
Yeah.
Well, I had enough experience with all of the major law firms in the state of Maine that I probably could have passed the environmental law bar exam if I needed to at some time. Because I learned so much, and I still I do it today. I still work with my good friend Jamie Kilbreth, good friend of mine, and I know stuff. It's scary because I'll say, oh, what about this? Or when I was in the legislature, I could actually build on those experiences. Your Honor, this has been an outstanding pleasure. Will you come back and tell some more stories?
Oh, I'd be glad to. I mean, we're just barely getting into the stories.
I think it would be great. We'll get Paul to come back in with us.
Okay,
Your Honor,
great.
It is a pleasure. I just want to share one quick story with you. I told you this, but I'm serious. We were not allowed to sit next to each other when they had the State of the Judiciary hearing in front of the joint session, because we got in trouble for kibitzing, and I got told the last time I went in, you're not sitting with Judge Alexander.
Yeah, well, I had that problem with some other senators too. I mean, we're off now, right?
Well, no, we're still going.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, it's I knew a lot of the senators.
Yeah.
And so I would see them, and I don't have occasion to see them except the State of Judiciary, really. So I would, kibitz with them and kibitz with them and things like that. And for example, one of the senators from Brunswick and I, he'd had some issues with when they had the Amtrak train there and the diesels running in town and stuff like that. Yeah, because when I was, and I knew him, and he and I and they'd also had some issues with laws about worm fishermen. He does worm fishing. So I was talking to him about worm fishing and said to some of the other senators, because I had also done some of that when I was a kid, what we ought to do is we'll get some up and and invite senators. And we'll get you want seafood, we'll give you some seafood. And of course, some of the other senators were joining right in there. This didn't have anything to do with partisan or anything like that. And I guess the presiding officer didn't like that. I don't know if you were in the Senate then, or maybe you were forced to sit over on the other side.
I had to sit on the other side my last time in it. Judge, thank you so much.
Glad to do it.
We'll see you next time. We'll have you on again.
Yes.
We'll see you next time. Tune in to Talkin Maine with the Bowtie Boy. Thank you, Judge Alexander, Your Honor. It is an honor. It's just an honor for me to have you here today.
Glad to do it.
Thank you. See you next time.